Good evening, everybody. My name is Mervyn Sloman. I'm the Festival Director of Open Book Festival, which means I get to, every now and then, choose conversations that I want to run, who I want on stage with me, all that kind of stuff. We're here this evening talking about the future of publishing, and I'm joined on stage by three people who, amazingly enough, all work in the publishing industry in very, very different capacities. On my immediate left is Karina Szczurek, the founder, owner, everything of Karavan Press. Mbali Sikakana, who works at NB Publishers, and Eugene Ashton, who plays around at Jonathan Ball. Instead of introducing them properly myself, I've irritated the hell out of all three of them, which is always a good way to start a conversation. By asking them to do as what Mahalo always refers to as the elevator pitch. I have asked them all just to very briefly introduce themselves in terms of their jobs, what they do, and share with us something that they are that they absolutely love about their work in the industry, and something that they are not so happy with, or something that they find very frustrating, or something that they hate, however they want to frame that. Karina, would you like to start? Let me rephrase that. Karina, will you please start?
With pleasure, Mervyn.
Oh, thank you.
So I always consider myself primarily a reader. So that's how I introduce myself. I am primarily a reader, and that's how stories came to me. I'm also a writer, and I almost stumbled into publishing because I was around the publishing industry in all sorts of roles for many, many years. And I saw many stories that I thought should find a way to readers, falling through these cracks of traditional publishing. And that's how I founded and started Karavan Press 4 years ago, almost on the dot. What I love about what I do is that I managed to give some of those stories a home, a literary home, and I think what I'm most passionate about is working with the people that I work with, so the authors, but also, and some of them are here in the audience, but not only the authors, but the booksellers like yourself or Christy here, or the designers who work with me, the typesetters. Monique is here. So it's really about the people and the stories for me. What I'm most passionate about, and what I'm most frustrated about is cash flow.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Karina.
Yeah, I still have my liver, but the kidneys are in danger.
Mbali?
I'm Mbali Sikakana. I'm a senior editor at NB Publishers. What else about me? It's kind of a corny story now, but this is my second career, which makes it all the more exciting and interesting. What frustrates me and what am I passionate about? I'm passionate about understanding South Africa through bookmaking and, book selling. But that's also frustrating, trying to understand South Africa through bookmaking and book selling. So,
I'm Eugene Ashton. I'm with Jonathan Ball Publishers. I run Jonathan Ball Publishers. What I enjoy the books, straight out. I'm in it for the books, nothing else. I don't particularly like the people. I really
the people
mainly,
you work with, or general public?
Mostly the customers is the one where I have but Mervyn still pips the post. So we like Mervyn because he likes books. No, but on a serious note, I mean I really am in it for the books. What I don't like, and this is what worries me, and this is a bit of an oblique answer, but I think it is probably the single greatest threat to our industry besides the government. And that is online retail, actually. I worry about online retail, and that's what I'm uncomfortable with. You said I could also go with.
Okay, let's start with that. Why?
So I'm going to tell a little backstory to explain this, so that I don't have to be specific about online retailers, because obviously they're customers and I have to look after them. But I went to Batuli in 2000 and August of 2017, just for a week-long break with my wife, and it was before we had kids, and I'd always wanted to go to Batuli because it's an interesting place. So I get to Batuli, and it's not such an interesting place anymore. It's still historically interesting, obviously. And one of the observations I made is that the town had been utterly destroyed by the arrival of national retailers. So instead of having a chemist owned by the local pharmacist who would then, sponsor the rugby side because he was invested in the community, or a grocer who owned the shop, and the money left the town. And so as a consequence, the town collapsed. And that's my great fear with retailers who don't take an interest in the investment, in the community investment, who don't take an interest in ploughing back into, because reading fundamentally and books fundamentally is about community. It's about libraries, it's about bookshops, it's about, so think very hard when you click to buy a book, because it ultimately undermines the very fabric of what we're trying to do.
Interesting. How big a how big a market is digital for you at the moment?
It's not digital so much as on-screen
online
ordering.
Yeah.
So how big is the digital market in South Africa? It's probably about a fifth of all book sales. It could be as much as 40%, but it's probably not much more than that. The whole of South Africa would be digital. And then in terms of physical book sales through online retail, it's about 15% at this point in time.
Okay.
For the whole market, that is.
I want to start by talking a little bit about pricing, okay, because that is something that's, I don't think it's the most important issue in the industry, but it is something which I think does provide a lens through which to look at some other issues, and it is something which is pretty sort of prescient at the moment, because we're seeing some quite radical shifts. So I think that's, and also just for the purpose of this conversation, just to make it clear, we're going to be talking a lot about publishing. We're also going to be talking about distribution, right? And so a company like Jonathan Ball, those are two very, very separate processes. Okay, so they've got a local publishing, which they publish books locally, but they also bring a hell of a lot of books into the country from overseas. And there's some interesting stuff going on at the moment where between those two things. Karina, I want to start with you in terms of pricing. As a small independent publisher, if I ask you how much does it cost to make a book, do you have an answer to that?
Mostly book by book, yes.
Okay, and roughly.
So I don't know. Would you like to know about a specific one, like a poetry book? Or,
okay.
Yeah. So let's say a poetry book. So the costs to make a poetry book for me would be, because I do most of the editing and proofreading myself. Those fall away. So that's my kidney. And then it's really just a typesetting and design of the cover, and the printing costs and the distribution costs. And the design for a poetry volume will range anything between 5,000 to 7,000 rand. Then the printing costs for a small print round of around 250 will be 14,000 rand, depending also obviously on how many pages. And then and the distribution costs are 25% of the net price, and the net price is minus 15% VAT and the bookseller's discount.
Okay. How many, if you're looking at it, okay, two things. Firstly, the first thing I just want to make a comment, and which is interesting, is that, and it is a story that you hear over and over again when you're talking to small publishers, is that there are things that go into it which are almost discounted cost-wise, because the person who's doing it is just doing it themselves. Okay, Nick Mulgrew with Rushlanga,
Yeah.
very good example of that. Doing all sorts of things in terms of typesetting and design or whatever, which wasn't costed into the book.
Yeah.
How many copies of a book do you need to sell? If you're thinking about, okay, am I going to publish this? Do you have a thing in your head which goes, I need to sell 300, 400, 4,000 copies?
Well, I should, but I usually don't, because the only decision that I take is when I read a manuscript is, do I love it or not? If I love it, it almost doesn't matter what it will cost to produce it, so I will find a way. And then my greatest hope is to break even, and my great fortune is that I have no overheads whatsoever. So I am Karavan Press, so I have to feed my cats. And I have a roof over my head. So basically, I'm not responsible for the payments to employees and so on. I do have a huge responsibility to the people I work with, so anybody that I ask to do stuff for me, I am meticulous about paying those invoices. That's very important to me, and I'm religious about paying royalties. And in that respect, it's also very important to me that I pay authors at least 18% of the net price, which is quite high in South African standards. But I said to myself, as a writer myself, when I went into this, I decided that I wanted to be as generous as I possibly could be to authors. And then because it's all about me and what, and about my cats, really, I mean, that's the responsibility that I have towards the little family of four, the furry ones and I break even very easily. So I have not made any losses with any of for example, the poetry collections that I published or the short story collections that I published. And with them, it's maybe 170, 180 copies, and I'm already in the clear. And with anything bigger, it's around 400 copies. So I can afford to be passionate about things because it's almost certain that I'm at least going to make my money back. And if not, then another project, because I've been fortunate enough to have had a few projects that did take off, sold a lot more, made me some money, that I can plow back into the other things.
Okay. Mbali, tell us a little bit about the process for you in terms of deciding, yes, we are going to publish this book, how that decision happens, your role in that, and what are the criteria, and where do the sums come into that?
It's an interesting one because obviously I don't make the decision all by myself. I might think there's something in an idea, there's a commentator out there who seems an expert in something that I feel other people are interested in, and I might approach that person and say, hey, would you be interested in writing a book about this? And let's say they say yes, and now that's sort of like the starting block. And I've got to convince my teammates that this is a good enough idea. I'm not just deeply within my own insular tastes, which can also happen. I want to read what I like to read about, but that doesn't mean there's a market for it in the country. So it's sort of like people helping you to think outside of yourself and imagine a large enough market for what you're talking about, not just your friends. And from there, maybe we all agree that you've actually got the right idea here, and we might also build it up a bit more so that there's more to it, so that it is a book, not a magazine article, not some other format being more appropriate. And then beyond that, in our particular context, our company has to agree that it's the case. So it's not just an editorial decision, but it's a decision by also all the other departments that would have a hand in that project. So in a way, the people that sell the book have to be in agreement that they can sell it and they know how to sell it, and that they agree there's a market and they've seen that that's the case. Sometimes there is those leaps of faith, there is that experimentation as well. But a lot of the time, it's more of like a collective decision that's based on educated guesses and historic successes and other similar type of projects. So for me, it's like it's a process. And then I might get to the end, and I get to then continue on with it. Yeah.
Books like, so you've recently published Black Racist Bitch, Moshi Tidy's book. Were those books that came to you in terms of submissions, or were those what you were just describing now? I think there's something, and you reached out to the author.
Yeah, so in nonfiction, we don't get a lot of amazing submissions just in our inbox.
Well, you say you don't get a lot of amazing submissions. Does that mean you get a lot of submissions?
We get submissions, but
Okay.
I think a lot of people think they know what a book is and what what's of interest, but a lot of the time, people write about their own lives, and it's sometimes something that has a broader appeal, but a lot of the time, not. So we would more often than not commission people and ask them to write, and then give them enough time to give us the project in full. So in these two instances, yes, I asked them to write after having, I found Mushitari on Twitter and I found Tandiwe on TikTok.
Huh. Interesting. Okay. Don't often say this, but I'm really glad that you're on social media. Those are two really amazing, important books. Okay. Don't need to go into TikTok now. Eugene, how do you guys decide what to publish?
Look, I mean, there's there's always some sort of metric that you can apply to something. So if it's a commercial decision because you think that there's a market for something, you're going to pursue it. A lot of our publishing is, of course, commissioned, so it's the other way around. So our non-fiction publishing, which is the mainstay of what we do, in almost all instances, we go out and we commission those books, and in most cases with authors that we already know, or journalists that we've worked with in the past. And then, let's say there is a perfect book that rocks up on your desk, which is a rare thing. Once you've assessed and you've decided you want to publish it, and that decision to want to publish it will sit around the commercial metric, principally for the publishing team particularly. But there are other people in the organization who publish a bit more, like Karina does, and thinks that it doesn't really matter what you're going to sell of this book. It's an important book and it should be out there. And that's based on the old, you take the gains on the commercial front so that you can advance the cultural front. Because if you don't, as a publisher, publish books that are on the other extreme, I don't really think you're a publisher then. I actually just think you're a factory, and that's quite boring. And then, of course, there's other areas of publishing. So different areas have different dictates. So if you look at, for instance, natural history, it's about having the definitive work in a particular area. So if it's Palgrave's, it's trees or whatever it is. And they're the metric is it an area of interest, and is there a definitive book, and can you publish into that market? We do not publish a lot of poetry anymore, sadly. I am trying to change that, but I find our publishing directors, both who I've worked with, very resistant to my influence. Annie. No, but really,
the last organogram I saw had you as the boss. But
don't be fooled.
okay.
It's the days of servant leadership.
You published an amazing collection, Years of Fire and Ash,
Yes.
edited by Mbali.
Yes.
Last year? 2 years ago? Yeah.
No, we do. I mean, we do, and this is where I have to, give recognition to the publishing team. There is some brave publishing that happens, and it is the sort of publishing where you're not sure what's going to happen, and then sometimes you get surprised, and that's just wonderful. That's what publishing is about.
Okay, I started off a couple of minutes ago saying I wanted to talk about
Pricing.
Pricing, yeah.
So can
and
I
then
give you the shock?
And then I ignored that.
Can I give you the shock statistic? You're not going to like this.
Okay, shoot.
Books in South Africa are now the cheapest that they've ever been in the history of book selling in this country.
That's a cut.
Now Mervyn, let me qualify that. The problem that we have in South Africa is the economy. And so if you turn this thing on its head and you say that let's assume that books are calibrated in an international currency, which they principally are, because our input costs are calibrated in dollars. It's not, you can talk paper, the purchase of paper, ink, printing, all these things are dollar denominated. Because if there's a market outside of South Africa for something, it's gonna fall to the dollar denomination. That's the problem. So our problem is that we have an incredibly weak currency. And I've analyzed 30 years worth of data. And as we stand here now, books are cheaper on an international basis than what they've ever been before. If you look at books just in the South African context, they've never been more expensive. And that's the problem.
Okay, yeah, so we're in South Africa.
Yes, I know.
Okay, I'm selling books
But
up the road in South Africa.
if you want to solve the problem,
yeah.
if you want to solve the problem, then look no further than the government, because the economic conditions in this country dictate. I'm going to just put this point across.
Okay.
The economic conditions in this country dictate what happens to book pricing, unfortunately.
I get that. I do think, though, that any argument which is constructed around the solution involves or is dependent on government needs to be relooked at. And we need to take responsibility ourselves to some extent.
Sure.
Okay.
Which is what we're doing.
Yeah,
so you
okay.
take costs out of distribution and you take costs out of publishing, and you have Karina arrive 4 years ago, publishing into a segment in the market where nobody was publishing before, frankly, and doing very, very good work. And so the more we get put under pressure, the more creative ways we'll find, and we'll continue. But ultimately, the economy of the country will dictate where we go.
So, question here. Sebastian Barry, Irish writer.
Yes.
I hate the word literary. He's a literary writer, whatever the hell that means. He does well in our market. He's not huge.
Yeah.
Okay, he's sort of respected. I think it was February or March of this year that his new novel came out, and I had been warned. Prices were going through the roof. We had a triple whammy. We had the rand going for a pile of shit. We had the international freight charges because of the oil price, and we had British publishers deciding that their books were undervalued and they're putting up their prices, right? So Sebastian Barry's novel was the first one where it went, that I remember, coming in unexpectedly over 400 rand.
Yeah.
Okay? And I looked at that and I was like, we're not going to sell this. Okay. I was wrong. Have we sold as many as his, similar novel which was published 4 years ago and cost 280 rand? No. Okay. And what the question I've got here, there are a lot of questions, but one of the questions is, what's the end game here? Where are we going with this? Okay. And what is our thought process in terms of that kind of pricing of books coming into the country, outside of, in 18 months, government's going to make everything better?
Sure.
Yeah.
I didn't for a moment think that government was going to do anything. So, my planning doesn't involve any optimism on that front.
Okay.
So two things happen in that scenario. And again, if you go and look at international markets where this has happened, you'll be delighted to hear, for instance, that there's still a flourishing publishing industry in the Ukraine. So, even in war zones, you can continue publishing. Now, I'm serious, because this is an important point. Because what happens is that when the differential gets big enough, in other words, when the books become so expensive that you're no longer able to sell at the international price point, then the market either stops selling the books, or publishers start getting creative and do rights deals, and if the book is sufficiently, you can sell a sufficient volume in the market, then you would basically buy the rights to publish locally in South Africa, which may not reduce the price all that much, but it could reduce it by as much as 20 or 30% in terms of the international price point. Because remember, if you're buying internationally, you're paying international royalties, you're paying, all of those things are built into the chain in sterling or US dollar. So that's a scenario down the track for international books if South Africa continues deteriorating at the rate that it is. So there isn't.
Is part of that also printing locally?
Yes, you'd print locally. Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
Why are we not doing more of that anyway?
We are doing more of it, and we're doing more of it every single day. But it's still, the economies of scale are still not. It's still not there. So it's still far cheaper, unfortunately, to print internationally, principally because with exactly the sort of Sebastian Barry example, that's an international trade paperback, which typically gets sold in Ireland, India, South Africa, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand. Right. So they're going to build up a print run.
Airports in the
and
UK.
airside in the UK, yeah. So they're going to build up an international print run, which they'll print in the UK and then parcel off into the various territories. Whereas if you split it off into the various territories, it becomes a much more expensive undertaking because the print runs are shorter in each of the individual territories. So, printing is very simple. The first one's hell of an expensive, and the 10,000th one is very, very cheap. And the problem is that you need to have a longer print run. The longer your print run, the more economically viable it becomes. So if you break up the print run and sell it in different territories, it's difficult to make the book work. And don't underestimate how expensive it is to publish in the UK now. UK pricing has compounded over the last 3 years at 20-25% in terms of input costs. So there's massive pricing and margin pressure in the UK. So they will do everything in their power to control the costs domestically.
So you're saying that if we get beyond a certain point,
Yes.
then the future becomes about, in terms of international books, becomes about buying those rights and printing locally. And
Publishing locally.
Okay.
So
well, let me move on to something else because it kind of relates to that, and I want to bring the others into the conversation as well. So one of the things that occurs to me at the moment is that as we're seeing we're seeing an increase in price of local books, right? But there's a much bigger increase in terms of international stuff coming into the market. Is this not a moment? Does this not provide an opportunity for us to be drawing people's attention to the fact that local books are relatively more affordable than international books? And how are we communicating that at all? Should we be focusing on that?
I think because the majority of the books in the store are not local, it kind of, it would create that bias that books in general are quite expensive. So I agree that, highlighting that would do some level of good. But I also think that part of why people have a certain understanding that those books have earned their price. They should be a little bit pricier, I don't know. So perhaps we do need to also create some esteem around our own production, our own cultural production, and the fact that, yes, our books are slightly cheaper, but whatever you pay for a South African book is also a worthwhile investment. I think that's where sometimes I hear people saying, I can't pay this for this kind of book, but I'll pay it for a Michelle Obama or whomever. And so you'll find those books come in and they're very expensive, but you still see them on Nielsen's at the very top. So it's also people's attitudes around what's worth investing into and what isn't.
How do we change that?
Changing attitudes.
Keep fighting for the ANC.
How do we change that? Doing enough serious work, producing enough serious South African books that people can be proud of. People have to have the evidence. People need to be able to see that when I read a South African book, I'm smarter. I don't have to read, Malcolm Gladwell to be smarter. I can read something local and get the same result. They need to just be convinced of that and know that.
I don't know a lot about the Indian publishing world, the Indian publishing model. What I do know is that they are, for whatever collection of reasons, able to produce books very, very cheaply, produce books which are on very cheap paper. There's minimal sort of design ethics, that kind of thing. Are we looking, is there a consideration that going forward we should be looking at different kinds of publishing in South Africa? That we understand that the cost of books puts them out of the reach of the vast majority of people in this country? And should we be looking at not stopping traditional publishing, but publishing in different kinds of ways which are a hell of a lot cheaper? And is that something that can be done within publishing institutions that exist at the moment?
It's a complicated answer, but the reason India is able to do what they do is they have vast raw numbers. So they have an Indian middle class now is 600 million people. They can do print runs of 400,000-500,000 copies of things, and so the economies of scale are just there. Now, the first thing you're going to say is, well, why don't we just import those editions? Because that would be the most obvious thing to do. But the problem is that the rights don't work that way, and the Indian market is principally owned by the British in terms of they're all subsidiaries there are Indian operations that are independent.
Sorry, I just want to interrupt you. I'm not talking about importing the Indian version of Sebastian Barry.
Yeah.
I'm talking about publishing local stories, local writers in different ways.
Oh.
I often thought about that model, but I don't know the finances behind it. But I grew up among other countries. I grew up in a German-speaking country in Austria, where as a student I made use of these Reclam little books. They are mostly in German, but some of them are published in other languages, and they are small, very cheap, very thin paper where there is absolutely almost no design on the cover, and small print, and they cost a few euros each, and you can have just about anything in that format. And so even today in my mother's attic in Austria, there is a whole collection of these books, because that was a very cheap way to get access to the content. As a student, I could afford to read these tiny little books. And I often thought about that couldn't one translate that into the South African market? But every time I tried to think in that direction, because one of the things that I wanted to do right in the beginning was to go for these uniform covers. So something like the
Fitzgerald.
Yeah, I had that idea in my head in the beginning, but then when you start talking...
So Fitzgerald is I'm not even sure where they're based. Published overseas somewhere, and basically all their covers...
beautiful blue. Yeah.
All their fiction is just plain blue, and it's with the title and author, and their non-fiction is all plain white. There's no... That's it. That's the design.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Gallimard in France does a similar thing. So that's also very plain but beautiful. You enter a bookshop and you immediately see these books. So in a way they are striking. But when you start talking to individual authors and say, well, let's make a cover like that, they go like, but my dream was the cover. It's like without the cover, it's not a book. So I understand that as well, because I remember when my first book with my name on it was published, the cover was really, really important to me. So one doesn't want to, you want to, especially as a debut author, you want like the royal treatment, you want everything. You don't want a tiny little plain book that nobody can, or needs a magnifying glass to read. So it's difficult meeting those expectations. But then on the other hand, I never, as a student, I'm thinking back to that time when I just wanted access to the content, to the riches of those pages. I didn't care how it arrived. And I was so happy that I could have it for €2.99. And a lot of those works, because they were taught at university or at schools where French and German was being taught, were also in the original. And then they just had a different color of the cover. But yeah, they were amazing because one had access to the content. But they weren't books that, apart from a few people who actually collect them, they weren't books that were beautiful as objects that you wanted to treasure and keep. And I think that I definitely went into publishing also to create beautiful objects. So something, we all love opening a book and smelling a book, and I'm absolutely cuckoo about flap covers. So if I can't have a hard cover, then at least I want a flap. So that's why most of the Karavan Press books have flaps. And it's,
I have experienced Karina's flap fetish recently. Yeah.
So, yeah, it's those things that matter that somehow give us an additional joy.
Yeah.
But expensive
I
to produce.
still think there's got to be space for both. I still think that we need to be thinking about putting the written word out there in different ways.
That's digital now, hey? Just remember that. And that's why internationally the trend is actually against the cheaper editions. So even if you go and look at classics now, you don't get those cheap and nasty editions anymore. They're systematically being eradicated. All classics, in fact, are going up the value chain in terms of production values and design and so on, to the point where some of the classics that are being produced out of the States now are commanding prices of $50 and $60. I'm serious. There's these painted classics now, the painted jackets. They are absolutely extraordinary. And they, we're talking about Moby Dick in that edition, and it's 10 times the price of what you would have paid, 5 years ago.
I have Moby Dick in the Folio Society edition.
There we go. That's beautiful. Oh.
Because I just, and it has a case, and it's leather bound, and it's just gorgeous. But,
We'll talk classics afterwards.
Yes, that's fine. I think that's fine.
Digital's inserted. It's because of digital. So the ebook has inserted itself into that space. And again, if the South African library system was functioning like other library systems are around the world, then you're able to access that digital edition, from your local library. And so we need to separate over here the commercial undertaking of publishing from the requirement to advance reading and literacy.
Absolutely, yeah. I would add a rider there, in terms of your implied criticism of library service. I think that, of course, they are underfunded like everything else that's worthwhile. But there are also a lot of amazing libraries doing amazing work with really, really, really good collections. One of the things that's missing there is government going, okay, here is whatever that money is, to separate out from the other library budgets and go, we will purchase 400 copies of each locally produced book and distribute those in libraries, and then but that's a different conversation. There's a I want to we'll leave that part there. Maybe we'll come back to it in question time. I have a little bit of a thing about the book industry. So not just publishing, but the book industry, us as well. that there's certain things, certain ways in which we look at things, which mean that we are inherently conservative, and more conservative than we should be. Okay, and I've got sort of things in my head which provide content to that. But just to pull a couple of comments that have been made this evening, Mbali, you were talking about in terms of deciding about things being published, looking at I think your phrase was historical success. Eugene, you said you talked about authors that we already know, so we trust that we're going to sell a certain number of books. When publishers are trying to are selling books to us as booksellers, the primary methodology that is used is comparison to something else that has happened in the past. I hear a lot of stories in publishing companies where people are going, the only way I can convince my peers to publish something is to make exactly what you said, is to make a comparison to something that worked in the past. Is that a fair comment? And is that something, how can we change that if that is true?
I think it's interesting because in our particular space, we did a lot of experimenting during the pandemic because people were at home and we just didn't know what they wanted to read even. So a lot of the books that came out in that time probably didn't have historic precedents because there was no historic precedent for a pandemic. So we tried to guess what people might be caring about, what they might be afraid about, what they might want to know more about to feel comfortable. And I think post-pandemic, we're still trying to find our way in terms of, what will people want to read now? And then we look at what is selling, and a lot of the time it is stuff that was selling a long time ago that's just continued to sell on. And I'm not sure if that's because, again, it just feels certain, and I know if I buy this book, I've heard about it from 10 other people for the past 10 years or 5 years or whatever. I know I'm not wasting my money, as opposed to something I've never heard about from some writer I've never heard about either. So it is difficult, especially as someone who likes to publish debuts, because no one's heard of these people. And I think when you try and find a precedent, I might use an international precedent, for instance, and make the argument that we are part of a bigger moment and we are also having the same conversation. Or I might compare it to something that I think is thematically similar, but maybe by a completely different type of author. Like if my author's a black woman and the other author's a white man, I might find a link in some way.
But you still, in order to win that argument, you're having to make comparisons to books that were published, whatever they were, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, as opposed to just going, I think this is amazing content. And there's no comparison to anything else.
It's the commercial imperative, it's the profit imperative that's embedded in it. If I was at an NGO or another place like that, I think we'd do passion projects only. But because there would be a bottom line effect and we have, certain things we have to do for shareholders and all of that, in a commercial enterprise, things like, will this sell well and how can I prove this are important. Because once the decision is made and money is lost, there are some levels of repercussions to that. So I think that's why we are tethered to that particular, even if we were selling widgets, we would have to prove that, this particular widget sold 5,000 units in the last year. And so we believe if we invest this much money in selling it this year, we'll get a similar or better return from it. I think it's that part of it that makes it slightly difficult. And it does sort of keep us in a cyclical problem.
What exactly is a widget?
A widget is like if you were in an accounting or economics textbook, a widget is just like a product without any specification. It's just like a placeholder. Any product.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. You wanted to say something.
Yeah, I'm thinking that this is exactly the cracks of the industry. So the moment you start thinking, I need to sell this because of the bottom line, it becomes difficult. And I hear from many publishers in the industry, in the commercial trade, traditional publishing, exactly that kind of frustration. And in a way, it's wonderful because then these stories and these authors come to me. But then on the other hand, I also understand that in order for these kind of books and these kind of authors to thrive, there has to be an entire ecosystem that is functional and healthy. And one person cannot sustain an ecosystem. So, and I really think that there is something to be said about passion and vision, where maybe if you stick long enough with it, and I'm really passionate about the fact of developing authors. You know, you don't have to have a commercial bestseller with the first, second, third, or maybe fifth book, but maybe with the sixth it will come. And I think one of the greatest examples where I directly was in the middle of it and very fortunate was An Island by Karen Jennings. Nobody wanted to publish Karen in South Africa before, even though she went to everybody and begged them. And when she arrived on my doorstep, I had reviewed her books, I read her, I just thought that she was absolutely brilliant, and I didn't care that it might not sell. I read the first page and I knew that I would publish it. And yes, of course, it was very fortunate that the book ended up on the Booker long list, but I would have been still proud if I had just sold 200 copies of that book, because it is an incredible and beautiful book. And that's why it had to be in the world.
I mean, I'm absolutely thrilled for Karen and for you that that book sold so many copies. I sort of, want to tear my hair out and cry a little bit that the reason it did was because of recognition from the global north.
But it's the same with Damon. You know, Damon had been a great writer all his life.
Yeah.
And
First published by Jonathan Wall.
why not anymore?
And then you ditched him.
No, Damon. No, actually, the real story over there is Damon went with his editor when his editor left JBP.
Yeah.
But this is such an important point that's just been made. It is an ecosystem, and it's layers of involvement in the industry. So publishing in real terms has very low barriers to entry. And if you're very successful as you've got a literary eye, you can
What do you mean?
these
Sorry,
things.
what do you mean it's got very low barriers to entry? Does it explain that?
Just it's not, as far as businesses go, it's relatively easy for somebody to publish a book, like a standalone book or whatever. So that's not complex. The complex stuff is the distribution and the sales network and so on. So Karina's able to invest in real terms in literary books, poetry, whatever, at the small end of the scale. And in the middle, you've got the rump of publishers that principally have the commercial. If you're not in business, you can't publish. I mean, it's a simple. If you don't make a profit as a bookshop, you're going to have to close down. So that's just the simple truth in the whole thing. But what it allows us to do at the other end of the scale is make deep investments in books. So there are projects that we commissioned 4 years ago that'll only publish in 3 years' time. These are around subject areas that are incredibly costly because you need to do whatever it is that goes in. I don't want to be too specific, but these are deep investments that commercial publishers can make, which are completely unattainable for anybody that doesn't have a balance sheet, that can sustain multi-million rand investments over multiple years. And that's the point about, the ultimate point about the whole thing is if a book is really deserving, no matter where it fits in on that scale, it will be published. It will be published. It will be published. It will find a way out. I'd honestly believe that.
Well, a good example of this is that I've had a few authors approach me with, for example, with cookbooks. And there, in order to produce a really beautiful quality cookbook, I don't have the money, no matter, and I don't have the know-how, the logistics, so I wouldn't even know how to approach it. But I've had offers coming to me, so it's something that I cannot do, even though I'm open to the idea.
I'm going to open up for questions in a minute. I just want to throw one other, and I mean, I know we're not. This conversation is not producing, clear, definitive solutions or whatever. But I think it's one of those conversations which, for me anyway, it's about little different things which spark, and we go away and we continue these conversations. Something else which is a big bugbear of mine, and that is around distribution within the African continent. It drives me up the bloody wall that as a bookseller, in order for me to have access to a beautiful collection of short stories published in Kenya, that writer has to be published by Faber or Granta or whatever in the UK, so that John of the Bull can distribute it in South Africa. Can we not find ways to make our words, our books travel in both directions on the continent? I don't know, using bloody ShopRite or something. Those companies move stuff around all the time, or just doing it digitally. Why as an industry can we not get that right?
I've actually done some work on this. Quite a lot of work, actually. And as I pointed out to somebody in New York the other day, you must remember that Lagos is closer to New York than it is to Johannesburg. But it's also closer to Cape Town than London is. No, sure. But the point is just that it makes an important statement about the geography of Africa. It is vast and it is difficult to move things around. And unfortunately, like all things, it's about the trade links and how the flow of merchandise works. So and ShopRite is breaking that, and they are going into Africa and they are building the logistical links, and it is definitely becoming easier for us to move stock in that direction, but it doesn't yet flow the other way. So we are increasingly able to move things up the African continent. Are you taking books that you're publishing here and supplying booksellers in Kenya? We are not on a continuous basis, but on an ad hoc basis, because we don't have market rights. So remember, the other thing that creeps into this is the historical control of copyright and who owns the market, basically, in terms of copyright. And that's a delineation which is becoming increasingly global. So there is a future point where there will no longer be such a thing as this is British or that's American or this is whoever controls or that's Kenyan or whatever it is. So at that future point where it's just global rights, then it wouldn't really move. It wouldn't really matter who supplied which market, and that's increasingly happening. South Africa is one of very few closed markets in the world still, which is also another odd thing which we can discuss at some future date.
I know that at some stage my distributor, because I theoretically usually get South African rights and for distribution also Namibia and Botswana. Botswana has never functioned, but for a time Karavan Press books were available in Namibia, but only because a very dedicated bookseller in a bookshop was ordering them, and then exclusive books also went into Windhoek, and they also started ordering books, but that stopped a while ago, and I have not had the capacity to investigate why. But there was movement.
SADC is relatively good. So SADC is the whole of the Southern African Development Community. The trade links work very, very well. We can get a book, to Eswatini as quickly as we can get a book to, Durban or whatever. And we can do the same, Maputo. The only one that's really dysfunctional, of course, is Zimbabwe, but that's for other reasons.
I know that I live in a fairyland, but I do, I don't understand all the logistics.
Yeah.
But in my head,
it's just very expensive. That's all it is. It's just very expensive. It's prohibitively expensive to move books around.
No, you guys, somebody here, should be printing what is being published in Kenya, and that same publisher in Kenya should be printing what you're publishing here?
One of the things that people are concerned about is the sharing of files. So the moment you share, let's say, a Kenyan book, they share the print files with me, and I can tell them, well, I printed 200 copies, and that's how much I sold. But on such a small scale, I could theoretically print 500, and they will never know. They will just never be able to look into this. But there is a solution to that, is when one does the, where you exempt the publishers, you just go directly to the printers. So the Kenyan publisher can say that Karina has, with Karavan Press, has the permission to receive these 200 copies that I'm commissioning you to print. And then they have control over how much I am making out of their books. That would be a way of doing it.
Okay, cool. Let's do that. You guys. Questions?
And suggestions.
And suggestions.
While we wait for questions, I also want to mention something purely as a reader, that I must say, people complain about distribution, how difficult, but simply as a reader, when a book is important to me, I really almost always find a way of getting it, even though it's not accessible usually. But I sometimes wait for it 2 or 3 years, because I will wait for that moment when somebody is traveling and will put it into their suitcase, and so there are ways, and I think obviously not on a large scale, but sometimes one also needs to understand that patience and a lot of love has to go into it in order to get the book that you want.
It works on a personal level. It's,
you know how often I show up on your doorstep and say, is it possible somehow? And then you will say yes, but it will take 6 weeks and it will cost 560 rand. And I think, well, okay.
And increasingly, I'm saying it'll take 10 weeks and it'll cost 3,000 rand.
Yeah. And sometimes one says no, but sometimes one says, okay, then rise for a month, but yes, I want it.
I think my question is maybe to Mbali. I want to find out what excites you about the future of publishing, and also what kind of increasing role do you feel AI will play in terms of publishing in the future, and does that excite you or does that scare you?
Okay, I'll start with the AI question. I'm still circumspect about what role it will play specifically, whether we will have AI written text and AI written or edited text. I've seen a lot of those types of software applications sort of pop up on my sort of search engines, type of results. I don't know what people want to read anymore, to be honest. Also, are people interested in an AI's perspective on the world? That's an interesting thought. Would an AI-driven editor save costs? I think so. Would it be effective in how it actually does the work? Looking at ChatGPT, probably not for a long time. I think it's a question we'll probably grapple with a bit in the medium term rather than in the very sort of short term. What excites me about the future of publishing? I think to be excited about the future of publishing, you have to be excited about the future of, or at least in South Africa, the future of South Africa. So you have to have a very enduring optimism about the future in general, because it's all tethered together. If I'm optimistic that we will have a growing reading public through, increased literacy and increased incomes, then I'm expecting that reading will become more, the segments will become more interesting, the type of genres, the type of topics. I will not be able to predict what kind of book will be very, very successful based on what I know is South Africa's political leanings. when I can sort of see those types of shifts happen, or if I have that optimism, then my optimism for publishing goes along with that. Because at the moment, it's very much a troubleshooting, problem-solving kind of environment, trying to understand how do we keep serving the South African public with the type of books that are both interesting to read, but also are responsible and not just sort of going along with whatever populist view is, you know, the wave.
Sorry, I can't actually see where the mic is. Okay, I'm just going to leave it to...
What can we writers, and especially unpublished writers, do to support, inspire, refresh, and maybe even reinvent the future of publishing?
I'm on the receiving end of reading a lot of manuscripts, and I think the one thing that I sometimes wish, and now it's happening more and more because of all kinds of things that I have sort of learned over the years, but I think, first of all, when as an unpublished author you're approaching a publisher, just have a look first what they are actually doing. Yeah, so that little bit of research and respect and also kindness, you know, if you want somebody to work with you, then maybe you should know first what they are actually about. And this is the first thing that I always say to writers, you know, or people searching for publishers or literary agents. I always say, look at what they do. Look whom they represent, whom they publish, read their stuff, and see how do you fit in, or will you perhaps be able to contribute to that story, and in what ways? And I've had quite a few writers approach me by now and saying, you know, I know that you publish this and this and this, and I think I have a slightly different story, but I think you might enjoy working with me because of that story, and it has worked, and yeah, and also be part of the community. It's especially in South Africa, it's quite easy to have access to the publishing market, especially in comparison to other countries. It's so, you know, come to festivals, go to the bookshop. When there are launches, get involved, listen to people, introduce yourself, be just part of that incredible, vibrant, very creative, very exciting community that we have here. So yeah, don't be shy and just become part of it, not expecting immediately to, you know, do something for me, but as you suggest, become somehow also giving.
I'm going to take a few more questions just to reassure people. It is after 7 o'clock, but I did take an executive decision to stretch this out to 1:15, and then we have to get out of here. Someone has a mic.
This year we saw the Pearls results that showed that 81% of 10-year-olds can't read for meaning, which means in future the reading market diminishes. It was a regression from the last time that South Africa was in the Pearls test, so we've got a problem there. When government then released its book plan, how they're going to turn this around, publishers were not mentioned once as a key player in the solution to the reading crisis. And when we had the KZN riots a couple of years ago and we saw that footage of the carnage in the province, you'd go into the malls and bookshops were always perfectly preserved. Clothing stores were wrecked and the bottle stores were empty, but the bookstores were in pretty good shape. So how do we get involved in solving the literacy crisis as publishers, and how do we make reading and books cooler?
I think one of the simplest ways, because, you know, we can't do it, but there are already people doing it. And the immediate thing that comes to mind is Book Dash. And it's so easy to support Book Dash, even by swiping your Woolies card. You just need to name them as your beneficiary. And these are, there are people already solving the problem. They just need a lot of support.
Yeah.
So yeah, and Boekdash is a very good example.
That's deeply practical. I'm very cynical when it comes to government. And I think it's almost a good thing that we're not mentioned in the plan, because the moment you get into their sites, then some ridiculous plans coming your way. But here's an important thing. There's a lot of work that gets done in terms of corporate social responsibility in the background by publishers, which is not very visible. We make very, very substantial donations, not just us, all the major publishing houses. There's a lot of work by the educational publishing houses to make books as affordable as they possibly can. There are lots of reading plans out there. The problem over here is that we don't seem to have the ability to get the people who have the power to move that into schools and to just be proactive about libraries particularly, which I think is ultimately the solution. It's a really, really, really worrying statistic, that, because it does actually mean that ultimately the publishing industry isn't going to be doomed in South Africa. It's just going to be very small, and that's very unfortunate. If you think that we're a country of 60 million people and our publishing industry is the same size as New Zealand, I mean, that says it all.
If you look at how books are made, you can clearly see that there's sort of tradition and respect and all that. Is it not high time that publishers start thinking of development and how to pitch that quality? Because we know books are great. Even the poorest of communities, they appreciate books. How then do you get publishers to get to a point where they compete for that space, for consumption, so that publishers are not sitting in their corners because they know they sell quality and tradition and honor and whatever, but get to a point where you're competitive, so that you're starting to think like Mervyn is thinking, because it's about supply-demand. You don't lower quality in order to attract quantity. It doesn't work like that in the real world. How then do you become competitive and hungry and innovate around ways? Because we know books are great. I know books that have changed my life. In fact, when times were tough, I never lessened my spending on books because that's what I spend on. So I don't need to be convinced about that. But I still feel that sometimes you pick a book and it's not convincing enough, the quality itself, because probably it's the same people and the same mold that you're putting this through, or it's the other way that there's no incentive from the consumer. How do you think like a consumer and attract consumers more and show that hunger?
I think what's interesting about books in South Africa is that, or anywhere, we're competing with all the other ways that people entertain and distract themselves. And, reading is a very, solitary, intentional type of activity. On top of that, people have all sorts of other barriers that they might have to reading, like pricing that we've discussed. So it's actually something I've been thinking about. How do you increase the value proposition of reading to people? What is so special about picking up a book and reading, and what is so transformative about it that I wouldn't get from a very well-written Netflix show, an HBO special, whatever. I think that's kind of where we are. I think we take for granted that books are important to everyone, and we take for granted that everyone knows why books are important and special and a way of life and a community and all of that. We end up selling books to the very same people over and over again, I believe, unless there's a lot of sensationalism involved and panic and politics and whatever else, or just what everyone else is talking about or whatever. The average book that would come out that's important, how do we get people to say, I just believe in books, I just like books, I just think books are important, and I buy books regularly? I think that's a market and a public. It's something I'm still thinking about.
I think possibly for a reader like yourself, where you say that you are very much prepared to, no matter what, you are ready to buy the books. I think that our responsibility is that once you actually have it in your hands and you open it, that you are not disappointed with the quality inside. And I think it's very often that we fail in those kind of last stages of polishing. So it's the typos, it's the lack of editing, it's the messy typesetting. You know, one has seen it all, and very often is when you do take out those 350 rand and you go home and it's, you know, the product is just, there are 5 typos on the first page, obviously you are disappointed. And I think that our responsibility is, and you can't eradicate it all, but our responsibility is to take you seriously and to deliver you that, not the quality and the beauty that you expect from that book, from the story.
I just want to know, music, film industry, everyone, when they release something new from someone we didn't know, someone new, they market that thing amazingly. You can find it everywhere, you know, when it comes out months before the time. In the book industry, I find I have to go and look for something. If I find a quote used in a movie or in a short reel on social media or in a Twitter feed or wherever, I find I go and look for that book then. So why isn't it that the book industry doesn't market books more openly, especially the question that was raised earlier to the industry in South Africa where 10-year-olds can't read anymore. People are all on their phones and social media, so don't you think that that's a market that needs to be looked into where you are putting it in front of people's faces or using the quotes in, on social media, making small reels about it so that the publishers and the authors get out there more visible?
Can I just make a simple point? There are 500,000 books published in the English language now every single year. There may be 500 movies out of Hollywood studios a year. So you know, the scale over here is just the number of books being published just doesn't allow for that sort of wall-to-wall marketing. And then very importantly, where a book is sufficiently, you know, is going to sell a sufficient number of copies to be able to warrant proper marketing spend, almost inevitably the audience already knows about it. So book marketing is incredibly complicated in that respect, and we spend, as Jonathan Ball, we spend a huge amount of time, and we've got 10 people dedicated just to marketing and publicity of books in South Africa. So, and even then, I don't even think we scratch the surface, and we do it very well, if I say so myself. I mean, there are lots of other companies do it very well too, but you're competing against everything, and it's just you're not gonna be able to make a real impact on, you know, on every single book. It's just not possible.
But did you just say something about the books, the bigger books, the books that sell enough, that warrant marketing spend?
Yes, in other words, where they're sufficient. I know it's got to be inverted, which is what we do, because the greatest irony in publishing is that the Harry Potters are going to sell. So you don't have to turn up the dial as much with Harry Potter as you would have to with something else that you know has the potential to break out. So we'll often invest a hell of a lot more on something which is where it doesn't necessarily warrant the initial spend, but hopefully it becomes something.
Yeah, because that is where we need to be spending.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And in festivals, and you know that's where the marketing money goes.
Yeah, all of it. Yeah, and the other thing I would say is just subscribe to the Book Lounge mailing list.
And we are on social media, all of us.
Yes,
yeah, very much so, and most of our authors are as well.
Yeah. Even me, occasionally. Okay, we are now really out of time. Our logistics manager will kick my butt if we stay on stage any longer. Thanks, everybody, for joining us, and a huge thank you to Eugene, Mbali, and Karina for helping me work through some of the stuff. We're going to continue the conversation. We're going to continue all these conversations, and I hope you will too. Thank you.